I mean, this is Mesopotamia. This is the cradle of civilization. This is the area where, as far as we're aware from recorded history, agriculture effectively, emerged and enabled us to start the process of civilization. And here we are, effectively destroying that whole ethos of self-sufficiency, by putting legislation in place that demands that the farmers destroy any seeds that they do happen to save, and that they are therefore forced to, by law now, to buy their seeds from Monsanto. And of course, the seeds that they are buying all contain the suicide gene, which means that there are no seeds to save. So consequently, a nation becomes totally dependent upon the corporatocracy.
Yeah.
I mean, this is completely outrageous. And if they'd have tried to do it anywhere else in the world, of course, it would have attracted some media attention on some level. But in Iraq, where effectively the US controls the outflow of news via their embedded journalists, very, very few people are even aware that this has occurred. And this is a trial. This is a test. I mean, in the US, Monsanto have been deliberately sowing seeds in farms in the west of the country. Actually, this is in the US and in Canada. And the reason they sow them in the west is obviously because they know the winds will blow from west to east. And so the GM crops, will contaminate the organic farms that are further to the east. And what Monsanto have been doing, and this is very well documented, and there's a wonderful documentary called The Future of Food, which actually looks at this case, where Monsanto was actually suing farmers where the wind had blown the seeds across onto their farms, and they were suing the farmers for illegally growing the GM crops because they hadn't got permission from Monsanto.
This is
this is absurd.
Yeah.
And Monsanto knew that they wouldn't ultimately win the case, but that wasn't really the point. The point was to effectively bankrupt the farmers.
Yeah.
And bring the farmers effectively under their control, because once the other farmers saw what was happening to the farmers that they were suing, they would just sort of meekly bow over to Monsanto and buy the license to plant the genetically modified crops.
And this is the case of Percy Schmeiser that you're referring to here, isn't it?
Exactly. That's exactly correct.
Yeah. This is incredible. And, another aspect to this, of course, is for those who are meat eaters, the growth hormone issue to all of this. I mean, this is not only about all the veggies out there. This is something that's going to affect the meat. Isn't that right, too?
Absolutely. And, I mean, again, very, very few people in Europe are aware that the European Union is currently paying $150 million a year in fines to the World Trade Organization because the EU refuses to import beef that has been contaminated with the recombinant growth hormone. So it's the recombinant beef growth hormone, RBGH.
Yeah.
And the reason that the Europe doesn't import it is not that it never has any intention of importing it, it's just that the time isn't right. So in other words, the PR machine hasn't yet reached a point in Europe where they feel that the people will accept this contaminated beef without sort of some kind of uprising. So the EU determined that we'll continue to resist and we'll pay the fine, but that fine increases each year, and this recombinant growth hormone is very pernicious. And let me give you an example. I mean, in the course of my time in the oil field, I lived in Texas. I lived in Houston, Texas. And, there's a slogan in Texas that says everything's bigger in Texas.
Right.
Well, you got to believe it. I mean, when I lived there, the size of the people there, it's enormous. They're enormous. There is obesity in Texas like you haven't seen anywhere else in the world. And, call it a coincidence, but, of course, Texas is a major cattle state.
Right.
Beef is effectively the national food. There's beef restaurants, steak restaurants, wherever you go all around Texas.
Right.
And the growth hormone is used as a standard in Texas. And clearly, the evidence would suggest that it's not stopping in the beef, in the cattle. It's actually carried through in the meat, and it's carrying through into the people that are consuming it.
Yeah, of course.
And so certainly that was a trigger for me, and I stopped eating the beef while I was in Texas. So yes, it impacts very much on the beef. Another area where it's impacting, of course, is in cloned meat.
Yeah, tell us about that.
And in the UK recently, I mean, the decision was taken. I mean, again, this is outrageous. The decision was taken that it is legitimate for farmers to sell cloned meat without actually declaring it that it was cloned. And this is ultimately how organic meat will effectively be removed from the shelves, because what will happen is ultimately the objective is to remove the requirement for labeling. Now, we have to be very, very careful with this observation about removing the requirement for labeling, because food that is grown, in organic farms, in small holdings, you wouldn't expect to be labeled, would you? It's going to be in boxes. It's still going to have the dirt on it. It's natural food.
Right.
The stuff that's sold in the supermarkets, obviously, there is a requirement for it to be labeled. Now, so there's one side of, there's actually a slogan in the US that the campaigners use, which is, effectively, only buy unlabeled food.
Right.
But this is potentially dangerous.
Yeah, of course.
Because the whole objective is ultimately to remove the labeling requirements, so the consumer has absolutely no idea what they're buying.
This is about also a kind of international standardization of food, isn't that right?
Exactly. I mean, Codex Alimentarius is global legislation. Codex Alimentarius committees, of which there are 27, all addressing different issues, but these 27 committees are spread out all over the world, and effectively what they're establishing is the template for global law. And in 1994, the Codex Alimentarius Commission was very, very close to implementing the type of legislation we're talking about in the US. And they got really right to the 11th hour when there's a chain of stores called Whole Food stores. And Whole Food stores realized, what was about to occur, and they picked up the challenge. And Whole Food stores, because it was sort of spread across the US and they had stores in all the major cities, they were able to mobilize, their customers. And millions of people hit the streets, and they had millions of people writing to their elected representatives. And, of course, the elected representatives realized that, there was, very serious awareness of these issues by the population. And if they didn't do something about it, basically, they weren't going to get re-elected.
Yeah.
And so in 1994, a piece of legislation was introduced, which is called the DSHEA legislation, which stands for Dietary Supplement Health Education Act. And it was through this legislation that it effectively put a ring fence around the U.S. food and drug law. But then what happened was the Codex Alimentarius Commission simply turned its attention to Europe. And basically for the past sort of 12 years, it's been working behind the scenes and, using sort of its tentacles throughout the EU to implement this legislation in Europe. And their thinking is that the various countries in Europe don't talk to each other, so they can actually introduce this legislation through the back door. And here we are now. I mean, we're literally at the same stage as the US was in 1993, because the game plan is to introduce this legislation with effect from December 31st, 2009. So basically we have 18 months to try and raise the awareness throughout the European Union of what is going on here. Now, it means that we have to address it wholesale, because there's no point in the British people, for example, raising it with their elected members of Parliament, because the British government has completely washed its hands of this legislation, and the British government has basically said, as have most of the other European governments, that they will do whatever it is they're instructed to do by the EU. So this is complete abdication.
Yeah.
So it really is now, in the hands of the population, to try and change this. Otherwise, basically, come 2010, the whole of the food industry and the natural medicines industry will have changed throughout the whole of the EU.
And this is very worrying, considering some of the stuff that is in here in the Codex Alimentarius. And I mean, what do you think would happen if this actually comes into effect? I mean, what we can see already is a kind of what I at least consider to be an artificially created kind of food crisis, but it's almost like they're preparing us and getting us into the mindset of this already. What's your take on this?
Oh, most definitely. I mean, there's no question. In fact, Gordon Brown, the British Prime Minister, has already given us more than enough evidence that the current food crisis is a deliberate manipulation to create the opportunity for the various governments to present to the people that, you know, the only way out of this is GM crops.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, as I'm sure, you know, your listeners are very aware, everything that's occurring is interconnected.
Yeah.
You know, the current phenomenal and ridiculous manipulation of oil prices is linked directly, you know, to the same issue here as with food.
Yeah.
As is the whole issue of the supposed requirement to be moving towards biofuels. You know, because, you know, in a food shortage, you know, how ridiculous can it be that instead of growing food, we're going to grow crops that can be turned into biofuels?
Yeah.
I mean, this is just completely outrageous.
Yeah. Sheesh, my God.
So the whole thing is being engineered to sort of create the perception that the only saviour here is to accept GM crops that can grow, you know, 3 or 4 crops a year. But you know, the real issue here is that the GM crops are completely devoid of the fundamental nutrients, minerals and vitamins that we need to be healthy. So the reality is that, you know, already our diet is being attacked, you know, by the use of herbicides, of pesticides. I mean, crops that are being developed. I mean, you know, I'm sure some of your listeners will have heard of Roundup Ready crops.
Yeah, we're talking
about
that.
These are crops that basically don't even germinate unless Roundup, which is a pesticide, is poured on them.
And even I think even the plants themselves are actually referred to as a pesticide or insecticide. You know, they're classified as such. You know. And we know that the animals won't touch it, you know, they won't even bother to eat it, but they're giving it to us humans, you know, no problem.
Well, you know, this is the great irony, Heinrich, that farmers will not feed this stuff to the animals. I mean, you're right, their animals won't touch it, but they won't feed this stuff to the animals, because if they feed this stuff to the animals, guess what? The animals get sick.
Yeah.
You know, and to a farmer, the animals are his livelihood. So, you know, he needs his animals to be in the best possible health. So, you know, there is no question. We are today treating our livestock better than we're treating, you know, our fellow humans. But, you know, there's a very, very important agenda here. Because, you know, as people become less healthy because the diet is suffering, and I mean, we won't even get into the area of vaccinations and all that stuff, but there is a pernicious attack on the total well-being of the human being.
Yeah.
And then, of course, who rise to the rescue? Big Pharma.
Yeah.
With a PH. Yeah. So we've got the pharmaceutical companies who in 2002, and I'm using that year because that's the year before the invasion of Iraq, when the oil companies got in on the act. But in 2002, the top 10 pharmaceutical companies, the profitability of those companies, those 10 companies, the profitability of those 10 companies was greater than the combined profitability of the other 490 companies in the Fortune 500. So the pharmaceutical industry is a major, major player. I mean, it has been, I mean, since the, obviously, Second World War, when I.G. Farben was one of the major supporters of Hitler and his National Socialists.
Right.
And, you know, today, you know, we have a situation where, you know, the big pharmaceutical companies effectively finance whomever it is that they want to put into power. And, of course, whoever it is they put into power is then expected to support their